Okay, now that we have covered the period between the founding of the nation and the 1820s, the age of the common man, now we need to talk about the causes of the Civil War. What all built up and led us to fighting our own neighbors. So in the early 1800s, the cotton boom took place. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in the late 1700s, which helped clean the cotton more quickly. If you look at the bottom left picture, that's what cotton looks like when it's on the plant. Nice, fluffy. Well, within it, it's got a lot of seeds and it's got a lot of like burrs. So it's very it's not clean and able to be used to make thread or cloth. You have to clean out the seeds and clean out the burrs and clean everything out so that it's just the nice fluffy white stuff. So the cotton gin helped pick it all out quickly and easily as a machine instead of having to do it by hand. Before it would take hours upon hours to clean it all out. Now it just took dumping it into this machine, which you can see on the bottom right, and you could just hand crank it. So therefore the planters could grow more and more slavery was needed to meet that demand. The number of slaves doubles between 1810 and 1840, all due to the cotton gin. If you look at this map here, well, we've got three maps. The one on the left, distribution of enslaved African Americans in 1850. If you look at Virginia, it's still a pretty big slave state. Prince William County was known to have the largest numbers of slaves in Virginia, up to about 1830, 1840. Virginia was the biggest slave-owning state up until about 1830, 1840. Then it became the Deep South states where had more slaves, like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. They tended to have more slaves because of this cotton boom. If you look at the top right map, you can see Southern cotton production in 1820. The major areas were South Carolina. You've got spots other areas, but South Carolina's got the biggest blob right there. If you look down in 1860, it's the whole South. I mean, you've got Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, a little bit in North Carolina. You've got some in Texas and Louisiana. So cotton really grew because of the cotton gin. The Underground Railroad took place in the 1800s. Harriet Tubman was a former slave, and she ended up leading over 300 slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. She was known as the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. So what the Underground Railroad was a loose network of whites and free blacks in the South that helped assist runaway slaves to freedom in the North. So if you look at this map here, you can see the major Underground Railroad routes. You kind of fed into it. You had to travel at night because you had to travel by darkness, and then during the day you would hide in Underground Railroad free black or white houses in a basement or in a cupboard or in a cellar or something, and then you would travel again starting at night in order to get to the free states and ultimately to Canada, where you could not be sent back. So the admission of new states and territories into the Union continually led to a conflict over where slavery could exist. If slavery was allowed, it was known as a slave state. If slavery was prohibited or not allowed, it's known as a free state. So the Missouri Compromise happened in 1820. You guessed it, because territories were expanding and we had to decide whether we needed slave or free states. So at this point in time, we had 11 free states and 11 slave. Keeps the balance in Congress. No group has more power than the other. Missouri was very crucial to this balance in Congress. The South said the North is trying to end slavery. The North said the South is trying to extend slavery. So in order to keep that balance, Maine was admitted as a free state and Missouri was admitted as a slave state. There are 12 states each now. Keeps that balance. The rest of the Louisiana Territory was split at the 3630 parallel, also known as the Missouri Compromise line. If you look at the map here, you can see the Missouri Compromise line is at the bottom of the blue territory, right above Arkansas Territory. So no state could be a slave state above that line other than Missouri or existing states. Every other state that came in above that line must be a free state. So also going on in the 1820s, you have the Nullification Crisis. We kind of talked about this a little bit before, but in 1828 through to 1832, Congress passed bills to raise the taxes on imported materials and manufactured goods. The Southerners were really ticked off because the Southerners, they send out all of their raw materials and import all manufactured goods. The South was farming, it wasn't manufacturing, so they had to import their manufactured goods. And they were like, wait a minute, we're paying more money, what the heck? The North, of course, enjoyed it because the North wasn't importing, because they were manufacturing. They were exporting. They enjoyed it. So John C. Calhoun, he was the vice president and a Southerner, South Carolinian, he said, nullify it. Make it so we don't have to follow it, which means reject because it's unconstitutional. So South Carolina decided to nullify the tariffs and threatened to leave the Union or secede. President Andrew Jackson said, hey, wait a minute, that's treason. Henry Clay decided to offer a compromise. So you can see the state's support for the tariff. Green is for it, and blue is split, so the far northeast was split on it. But then the red was far against it. North Carolina all the way down through the south was very against the tariff. So slave rebellions. You have 1800, 1822, and 1831. Gabriel Prosser planned a rebellion in Richmond. That was 1800. Denmark Vesey planned a rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, and Nat Turner planned a rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. There was immediate retaliation for Nat Turner's rebellion. So in Nat Turner's rebellion, 60 whites were murdered because of the rebellion. So what the whites decided to do is they decided to just start attacking blacks. Free, slave, didn't matter. They ended up killing about 200 people, and most of them were innocent, had absolutely nothing to do with the slave revolt. It strengthened the resolve of Southern whites in order to control the slaves. So they did this through slave codes, stricter laws, slaves can't do certain things. So that led to a lot of issues. There was also the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That said that if you ran away into a free state, you could be returned to your state, still slave. So whether you were in a free state or not, you got to be returned. And this led to also a problem because there were several free blacks who were taken up as part of the Fugitive Slave Act, like they were legitimately free, given their freedom, and they were picked up as part of the Fugitive Slave Act and sold back into slavery. So that became a large problem at this time. So you can see the number of slave insurrections from 1526 to 1864. I know that's a big time period, but if you look at the map, look at who tends to have the most. You've got Virginia, Louisiana, South Carolina, Mississippi. Virginia had a lot of slave revolts during this time period. So, Compromise of 1850. The Mexican Cession, that territory that we got from the Mexican-American War, should it come in as free or slave? California was able to come in as a free state. New territories were able to decide on their own, which is known as popular sovereignty. Slavery was banned, or slave trade was banned in D.C., and then the Fugitive Slave Act required free states to assist in the capturing of runaway slaves. They couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. So this became a real boiling point for North versus South. So if you look at the map here, you can see what new territories came in as free, what new territories were slave. Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was written in 1851 by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the wife of a New England clergyman. It was a very graphic depiction of life as a slave, which is very intriguing because it was a white woman writing it. She got firsthand accounts and she wrote this book. It gained tremendous support for the abolitionist movement, which means get rid of slavery movement, in the North. And this growing support scared the heck out of the Southerners. They called Stowe's depiction inaccurate and biased and just plain wrong. They're like, no, don't listen to it, it's all wrong. So it caused a lot of tensions as people were popularly reading this book. So now we are on our third act about free and slave states, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This occurred in 1854. It overthrew the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. And it said they were going to introduce popular sovereignty as the sole decision as to whether a state would be free or slave. So the people in that state or territory were allowed to vote and say, we want to be slave or we want to be free. So the result was Bleeding Kansas. So this is what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. Bleeding Kansas occurred in 1856. Thousands rushed to Kansas in order to skew the popular sovereignty vote. Southerners were rushing there to say, ooh, let's make it a slave state. And then Northerners were rushing there, abolitionists were, and they were like, wait a minute, we need to make it free. So it led to a lot of problems. Border ruffians from Missouri, so people hopped the border in order to come over, cast pro-slavery ballots even though they didn't live in Kansas. There weren't like voter ID laws or anything like that. You just went up and voted. So a lot of violence happened between the pro and anti-slavery groups, and it led to the birth of the Republican Party in order to oppose the spread of slavery. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. So Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. The owner took Scott into Illinois and Wisconsin, which are free states and territories, for several years. Later, they returned to Missouri, where his owner died. Scott began a lawsuit in order to gain his freedom because he lived in a free territory for a long period of time. He was like, wait a minute, I lived in this free area, why am I not free? So the ruling, as Scott was a slave when taken into the state of Illinois by his owner and was there held as such and brought back in that character, his status as free or slave depended on the laws of Missouri and not of Illinois. Upon the whole, therefore, it is the judgment of this court that it appears by the record before us that the plaintiff in error is not a citizen of Missouri in the sense in which the word is used in the Constitution. So this goes back to, is he a real person? Is he not? So this basically said slaves didn't have the rights of free citizens. And therefore, he had no claim to freedom because he lived in a slave state when he filed the lawsuit. And therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. This was able to clear the way for the expansion of slavery. The Northerners were not happy about this whatsoever. During this time period, you also have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in 1858, both Lincoln and Douglas were running for the same Senate seat in Illinois. Douglas was a supporter of popular sovereignty, again, voting to decide whether or not you have slavery. And Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, which basically means if the North and the South are divided on how they feel about things, this country is never going to succeed. Douglas won the Senate race, but Lincoln was considered an excellent candidate for the next presidential election, so he started amping up for that. So the election of 1860, Lincoln ran as a Republican. He won the election. He won absolutely no Southern states, and convinced Southerners that the North had no intention of allowing slavery to extend. Can you see why this would upset quite a few people in the South? If you look at this map, you can see the northern and far western states all voted for Lincoln. If you look at the South, from Maryland all the way down through Texas and Florida, they voted for the Democrat and the Constitutional Union Party candidates. They definitely didn't win because of this. The vote got divided. So what happens because of this election? South Carolina secedes from the Union in 1860 on December 20th. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union, and they insisted that states had entered the Union freely by going to fight the Revolutionary War, and therefore they could leave it or secede it if they wanted to. It was all their own personal choice. This decided to be the straw that broke the camel's back and led to the Civil War. If you look at this map here, you can see when specific states seceded, whether it's before the first incident of the Civil War or whether it was after it.